Larry, you can start.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. This is Larry Beck speaking. I hope you can see the screen. I want to introduce myself, Larry Beck. I've been involved with the aerospace standard since its inception. I've been a certified aerospace lead auditor since the initial certifications for aerospace auditors in 2002. I've worked in the industry for about 35 years. I'm currently on the Aerospace Technical Committee for Perry Johnson. And I've been doing audits since about 95. Shannon Craddock, our audit program manager, asked me to put this together for the purpose of presenting some common problems that we auditors document during certification and surveillance audits. So let me go ahead and get started. Maybe. Okay. What I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to go through all the standard, and I'm not going to talk about all the issues that auditors may write up. I'm just going to talk about the most common ones. But I'll discuss some of the issues we discussed by the clause standard numbers. I'll try to reflect the requirement that you'll see on the next page where I've kind of summarized the requirement. I'll talk a little bit about the nonconformities that we have, discuss some of the issues maybe that I see associated with it, and it would be helpful to have a standard with you there so you might be able to follow along. Please hold your questions to the end. It's a little easier, then you can write them into the system and we'll try to address them all at the very end. There'll be plenty of time left for that activity. Okay. First off, you'll see here the format. You'll see the book on the left-hand side, and it'll be an excerpt or it's kind of a summary of the requirement, and the things that I'll be highlighting will be in yellow there. The first thing we see is under issues that we have is under the scope. We had a recent ruling from the IEQG that talked about exclusions to post-delivery support. A lot of companies have taken a full exclusion to the 7514, but the IEQG said that would be inappropriate if you do any work after you've delivered your product, such as warranty work or repair work or completion of manufacturing tasks or non-conforming rework. And most of us do. Matter of fact, I think everybody does. Once they deliver a product, if the customer finds that it's not right, they'll return it. So if they return it, we can and we do work to it, we can accept an exclusion to 7514B. I know that's a little bit harsh on some of it because most of us it's going to be affected by that. So you need to go back and think about changing your exclusion if that's one that you have. And I can give you the IQG website, and I'll do that a little bit later on. You can look at that frequently asked question yourself and how it's been answered. The other thing we see is sometimes we see exclusions or people have been certified to the wrong AS standard, to be honest about it. We'll see a distributor that should be certified to AS9100, but they've been certified to AS9100. Now that's misleading, and we try to avoid that, and we certainly do try to write it up if we see a company that claims to be AS certified, but they're a distributor, and if they're AS certified to 9100, the guts of 9100 under 7.5 they exclude because they don't bill things, and the heart and soul of 9120, which is the counterfeit parts control, they don't do because it's not a 9100. So we look at that very carefully. Is the scope of the standard you're certified to the right one? As you know, any exclusions under 7 can be, any elements under clause 7 can be excluded with justification, but you cannot take exclusions outside of 7. One of the other things that we're seeing right now is an issue is this site designation. With the release of the 9104-1 standard that came out that redefined designations, and there's 5 categories now, The one that kind of confuses people a lot, including myself, is this campus and multiple. I strongly encourage you to look at the AS9100 9104-1, and it will give more definitions to what the 5 designations are, and make sure you're correct. Most of us are single site, and the complex sites are those Boeings and Lockheeds, the big guys. But you got to understand the difference between a several, campus, multiple. So if you've got multiple sites or multiple locations, or even a warehouse across the street that has a different, potentially a different address, that's not going to be a single site. Okay. The next thing we see is under the quality management system itself. This is an area that, even though it's under the general, under 4.1 general, this starts the basis or the foundation of the standard. And the first thing it says, companies must determine their processes needed for the quality management system. We're seeing companies identify only their core processes. Core processes meaning processes under Section 7. You'll hear me talk about this a little bit later, but it's all your core processes. The expectations are all the processes and all the elements of the standard being included in one or more of those processes. You'll see that under 4. There's linkage here because it says determine the sequence and interaction. Again, it doesn't say you have to document it. It doesn't have you have to write it down anywhere. If you just have to determine what they are, and the author has a right to ask you, what are your processes, what are the sequence, and what are the interaction. Now, when we go to 422C, under the quality manual, it says you have to describe those interactions. So this is what you put in the manual. So this is how this is linked. You'll also see linkage and the analysis of data, which is required for Section 8.4 and continuous improvement, and how that links to the F part, where it says implement actions necessary to achieve planned results and continually improve those processes. So we look for linkages here throughout the standard, but it begins with this basic requirements. Not too many write-ups occur in 4.1, except when we're filling out a pair and we find that the company does not have process measures, or the process measures are not being met. Then we go back and write it up against 4.1 C and F. The lack of complete QMS processes lead to most of our issues that we're finding right now. Again, although not required, auditors will ask for the information or has a right to determine, for you to determine what those information are and for you to share that information. We need it to fill out the pairs. We're going to need it to, some companies will have a turtle diagram and things like that. And this is no more than really a turtle diagram kind of an approach in words. So this has been an issue. It does fall into an issue. You'll see me talk about the same thing when I get into the manual under 422C. And there may be some questions at the end of the webinar about this thing, and I'll be happy to answer them. Okay, here we are in the 422C. It didn't take very long to get there. Inadequate description of interactions between the processes. Most quality manuals include some type of what we refer to as an IOP, interaction of processes, that show the processes, but the requirement is you have to describe the interaction of processes. So to describe the interaction of processes, you've also got to say what the processes are. And the interactions are really the inputs and outputs. Let me further explain this by the next chart here. If I go to a company and they show this is their IOP, interaction of processes, they show that they get stuff from the customer and they give stuff to the customer, and then their main processes, or what they would refer to as their core processes, is they got to get business, they got to get parts, they got to build it, and they got to ship it. That's pretty generic for most manufacturing companies. But is this acceptable? Does this meet the requirements? Is the question. And does it clearly describe the interactions between these processes? The chart does show that there is an interaction. It has an arrow going from sales to purchasing, purchasing to that. So it does show an interaction, but what are those interactions? Such as from sales to purchasing might be a work order. Does it include all the QMS processes that it should include? And the answer there is no. What it does include is the product realization processes. So where are the other processes such as 4, 5, 6, and 8? The support processes. They too have to be considered, and we have to write, we're not writing pairs on anything except for section 5, but we have to do process audits on all your processes. I'm reminding you again the requirement, it says you have to determine the processes under 4.1a, and in the manual you have to describe the interaction between the processes. I think this particular chart here does not include all the processes, nor does it have good definition of the description of those interactions. This is not an uncommon one we see, but it's something that's being written up very regularly now by auditors. Okay, continuing on, we see a lot of issues under control of records, and the main thing we see is it does require a written procedure, and in there it says the written procedure has to define the method for controlling records that are created by and are retained by suppliers. Oftentimes we see the list that says what are those records that we want them to control. Okay, that's all right, that's one thing, but this procedure's got to say what is your method for flowing down to your suppliers. Most of us have some kind of a quality note that we flow down on purchase orders. But oftentimes the procedures do not define what is your method. Expected controls could include things like the type of record, the retention time, the retrieval expectations, and certainly any customer flow down requirements. But the method is what I'm looking for, and then what kind of controls you're flowing down. Method would be a quality note on the purchase order, and that's what the procedure should say. Then how you do it is we'll look at the purchase orders and see if those notes exist. Okay, quality objectives. This is kind of an open-ended one also that we see companies struggle with a little bit, and how the quality objectives relate to the process performance metrics under 823. We expect to see performance metrics for all processes, and we expect to see the company have quality objectives, and the processes should link to those things, such as the quality objective must be established at relevant functions or levels of organization. That's what it says you have to have. So there's got to be some kind of top-level objectives that are measurable, and they've also got to support the quality policy, and you expect them to be linked to your improvement activities. An example here, I said note, quality objectives are oftentimes a high level, such as increased profitability, 10% increased profitability. Doesn't sound like a quality measure, but it certainly is, because the quality processes that support that would be things like, under manufacturing, reduce scrap by 10% or 15% or 18%. That would help support the overall profitability. So we expect to see objectives at a high level, and then a process performance metrics specific to the processes and supporting of the objectives. And sometimes we get the word goals, objectives, targets, all that kind of mixed up a little bit. And it doesn't matter. It's just what you define those things as. Whether you call it a goal, or you call it a vision, you call it an objective, you call it a target. There's some kind of hierarchy there, but you get to make that call what the hierarchy is in your organization. But we do have problems linking them. Sometimes we'll see the same metric or measure for all the processes. And you say, is that real? Is it the same process for everything? And yet you look at the objective, you look at the specific activities of the process, and it doesn't make sense. Okay, on the amount of responsibility, you know, this is not really a tough one, but we do seem to write up too many findings here. Companies are required to do management reviews. How often they do them is their business, and they have to justify that frequency. Most companies start off doing more often, and as they mature in their whole process, they may start doing them a little less often. But quarterly, semi-annually is not uncommon. Annually gets to be a little bit worrisome, and when I go to companies that do them once every 3 years, that ain't going to fly, because you'll determine they're not effective. And what we're looking for is effectiveness. Management reviews are meant to be a top-level strategic review of the implemented quality management system, not the day-to-day activities of scheduling problems, quality problems. They're meant to be a roll-up kind of an activity to give bosses a feel for how well the system is working. He's looking at the forest from a 50,000-foot level to see why some sections of the forest more green than others, versus the day-to-day activities looking for dead trees and cutting down dead trees. So it's meant to be a high level. The standard identifies some things that it expects to be inputs, and you'll see those as A through F. Those are the minimum kind of requirements that we expect to see that management reviews include. And some of the issues that we have associated with that is oftentimes it says you have to include, for example, results of audits. It just doesn't say internal audits. It says audits, results of audits, which means internal audits, external audits, customer audits, regulatory audits, health and safety, insurance, regulatory kind of thing. So it's all the results of audits rolled up and talked at management review at a high level, a summary kind of thing saying, boss, this is what we're commonly seeing, or what our folks are finding. Not the day-to-day, not every single audit activity necessarily or audit finding needs to be discussed, but certainly the roll-up, the summary of these things that the management can determine, is there some commonality of issues here. The effective frequency we talked about, and the lack of attendance. Sometimes we just see the attendance as the quality management rep. And that's not what this means. The management review is meant to be for top management. Does that mean every single person on his staff has to be there? Well, not necessarily, but you certainly would expect to see the representation and that he needs, and the boss gets to decide who that basically is. But we would expect to see representation from all functions of the organization there. Now, some management reviews are done weekly. When management reviews are done weekly, that tells me you've got a real weak system, that you've got to look at the effectiveness of the strategic effectiveness of your system weekly. That's probably not. That's probably a management meeting or a production meeting. So the frequency is important, and the frequency is something we evaluate because we're looking for action items. If there's no action items coming out of management review, then it's probably nothing more than a status meeting and not really an effective meeting to direct and redirect the quality management system goals and objectives. Okay, next under resource management. This is a tough section for most auditors because the standard is really weak under training. And so we're looking for appropriate competency, appropriate training, appropriate understanding of the job and how people reflect on that. It's not uncommon that we see job descriptions as a determination of what the expectations are for the job. Although job descriptions are not specifically required by the standard, we do see it a lot. Most companies have job descriptions. What we do see when we ask for how do you determine the requirements of the job and we're told job descriptions, then we expect to see some kind of controls associated with those job descriptions. How do you know you're looking at the latest one? How often they get revised? Those sort of things. Are they controlled documents? And then training records themselves is difficult because oftentimes in smaller companies particularly, they're kind of a decentralized function. Each supervisor maintains them maybe. And then we don't see training records necessarily or a training matrix necessarily for all personnel, such as management or admin. We certainly do see them for the skilled positions on the floor. And we certainly see evaluations and reviews and training and normally a determination of performance activities for personnel, but we don't always see that same level of scrutiny for doing the job and documenting training and keeping the records for the boss, for example. Some kind of records would be expected to see for senior management would be compliance records, and the EEO, the social economic kinds of things, workplace violence and such as that. So we would certainly expect to see training records for everyone, and we don't oftentimes see that from senior management. Contract review is an interesting one because many of the OEMs feel that contract review is a weakness in most companies. Matter of fact, some of your OEMs will even go as far as saying the majority of problems that they get with product, on-time delivery and missed and quality problems, starts and is the responsibility of the contract review. That suppliers do not do a good job of identifying the requirements. They don't do a good job of understanding the on-time deliveries. So the majority of the problems that OEMs have is with suppliers is that they have poor contract review. They also have a problem with the auditors a little bit. In fact, that auditors don't do a good job, personally, of reviewing or looking at the contract review activity to see if it's a robust system, to see if really all the risks are being identified and there's mitigation plans associated with the risk if you get the job. Contract review is before you get the contract and then after you get a contract. Before you get the contract, you're identifying all the risk. You're trying to get the business, but when you get the business, now you gotta produce those items that you said were risk. Now you gotta have a risk mitigation plan. And then we see a lot of customer-specific requirements that are missed. They're missed for several reasons. First of all, the POs are so difficult to read from some of these OEMs, 300 pages or whatever it might be, and we miss some of the nuanced, hidden kind of requirements. We can't do that. And when we come across it, we write it up as a serious problem. Missing specific customer requirements, not having a plan to meet those, and not having a plan to flow them down is a real issue for us. And we will look better, and we've assured the OEMs and such that we'll do a better job at contract review. So you can expect us to spend more time on contract review whenever we can. Purchasing certainly is one of the biggest sections of the standard, and a lot of write-ups we find in purchasing. It's one of the requirements that we have to look at annually. Under the 9104 and the 9101, it made some requirements that we have to look at corrective action, we have to look at internal audits, we have to look at management review, we have to look at purchasing, and we have to interview top management at least annually. And the reason why is because the OEMs and others have determined those are key elements of the standard. It says we have to evaluate and select suppliers, and the criteria for the evaluation and selection and the reevaluation must be established. So it uses the word maintain a register or list, if you will, of suppliers that includes two things. We expect this supplier approved supplier list to have two things: the approval status, meaning approved, disapproved, pending, and the scope of approval. The scope of approval is what they're approved for. And it's got to be specific, a family type, a product, commodity, a unique process. It can't just say raw materials. What kind of raw materials is it? So we expect to see those two things on approved supplier list. Now, most approved supplier lists are electronic, and we can find those things on there, and then we're trying to figure out, well, how were they approved? so it's got a, and then we see oftentimes that not all the type of suppliers are on the list. Service providers are missed real frequently. Service providers would be test labs, calibration labs, and we say, some companies will say, well, they're not really producing anything that goes through the product. No, they're producing things that affect the product, and they must be able to approve supplier list, and the way in which you approve them must be established. And the way you approve suppliers can be different for the different kinds of suppliers. Approving a calibration lab may be focused on ISO 17025, their certification, because you have to approve people based on their ability to perform. And then it says this periodic review of suppliers' performance. Oftentimes we don't see that. Management reviews insist on, that's one of the elements you have to talk about in management reviews, is supplier performance. And a lot of companies don't have a real robust way of capturing supplier performance. Supplier performance is normally on-time delivery and quality. It's the same measures that your customers evaluate you on-time delivery and quality. We sometimes don't see companies have a real robust system for gathering that performance measures, and yet the supplier performance is so critical in the success of an organization. So it's written up a lot as inadequate or not being done. Under the purchasing information, we're looking to see that the quality system requirements are flowed down, and certainly any customer-specific requirements. Quality management system requirements, in there it does use the word as appropriate, and sometimes things like that kind of confuse people. So when they see the word as appropriate or as applicable, they just say, that ain't us, we'll get that part. No, it's always applicable unless you can prove that it's not applicable. So we look to see that, are you flowing down quality management system requirements? Quality management system requirements can be nothing or a lot. It could be certification. But you would not expect a company to do business with suppliers that don't have some level of quality control. You expect them, I expect to see, and the standard has it in there, how do you flow down record retention? We talked about that earlier in the record procedure. To notify me of any process changes, to notify the buyers of any process changes. This is important because oftentimes we get products and we don't recognize that they've changed the material or they changed the coating or something as an improvement to their activity, but it actually kind of degraded our activity. So we should flow down to them that when I qualified you for this part, you can't change it unless you let me know that you're doing a process change. We also have the right of entry. That should be flowed down. Customer requirements that we also see would be socioeconomic things, DARs and FARs, certifications. They must use approved processors or approved sources. And this DPAS ratings, the defense priority ratings, is being missed. If it's being flowed down to suppliers, it needs to be, it's a flow down activity. Don't forget that can be real important, and that's one of the issues that we're seeing right now. It's a common fault that companies do not have that quality note for their DPAS ratings. So that's a common write-up that we're seeing now. Okay, under the product realization piece, which obviously product realization is extremely important to manufacturers, we see sometimes the routers, the job tickets, the travelers, the planning, whatever you call these documents, oftentimes they're not a controlled document. We see people that have, and meaning not controlled is they may have an obsolete version on the floor. We see missed operations. We see missed inspection stamps, real common. And I can understand that. Does the world stop if somebody forgets to stamp something? Well, if you say it's a requirement, it's got to be done. And if it's electronic, there again, we still expect to see those things accepted. But it's a common write-up, and it's kind of one of those things that can get you in trouble. When I talk about corrective action in a minute, you'll understand why it's important to keep it from happening again. Because if it's written up one time and the next time we write it up again, there can be repercussions from that. And we must account for all parts. And oftentimes we'll see the job started with 25 parts, ended up with 15, and we don't know what happened to those other 10. Where was the accountability? What happened? Were they rejected? Were they scrapped? What happened to them? Reference work instructions and our workmanship documents oftentimes are not controlled. Sometimes we'll see a piece of paper on a wall that says, make sure that the T's are all crossed. You know, there'll be a quality alert, for example, or there'll be additional work instructions or things like that. We asked for the controls for those also. Workmanship documents should have controls as well as any kind of quality alerts. And then a big one for our aerospace industry is FOD. It's in the standard in two places, in the in-process part of it and the warehousing or shipping part of it. It's the only requirements in the standard 2 times. We think it's that important. We need to see evidence of FOD provisions in every single, all the way through the supply chain. I don't care if you're making screws, you got to have a FOD program. Or if you're making engines, you're going to have a FOD program. We expect to see some evidence of FOD provisions in place that includes the prevention, detection, and removal. That's what the requirement says. Training, awareness, we see FOD posters, we see FOD checks on the planning, we see training videos, all the appropriate, we even see FOD procedures to some extent. So we expect to see it based on what you're doing and the level of what you're doing. The mitigation of the type of FOD that can interfere with your acceptable levels of your product. It might be dust or it might be a wrench, according to whatever your type, what you're trying to mitigate with FOD. Okay, I mentioned again, no provision for FOD for the preservation and product. That's the shipping parts of it. We expect to see some kind of assurance that what's being packaged and what's being delivered to the customer is FOD free. Need to see some kind of evidence that that's a check at that final closure kind of a thing. Some companies will even have on their routers, they'll have some built-in FOD trap areas. They're about to close something internally, they'll have a FOD check for FOD before you actually put this lid on it or whatever. Expired shelf life materials, it can be found in nearly almost any company we go to. Most companies don't have a real robust way of removing obsolete or out of shelf life parts. For example, you may be using a adhesive that has a 1-year shelf life on it, and all of a sudden engineering changes the adhesive to start using something else. Well, you need to pull out all that. If it was a part, the stock disposition would be to go out and get all those parts and scrap them or take care of them. But for some reason, we don't think that materials such as adhesives and things needs to have a stock disposition also. It needs to be pulled out and gotten rid of if it's no longer used. That's when we find expired materials usually. And oftentimes, people just don't like to throw things away. Paint, but everything has a shelf life on it. Everything has MSDS or SDS now. And we expect to see, we sometimes see in this particular area as well over work environment, the question about SDSs. Even though that's a safety question, it's still under an adequate work environment under 6.4. Natural handling material hazardous materials falls here as well as under 6.4. We find it a lot. People are not disposing of things correctly. Therefore, they're opening themselves up to litigation and other things. Inappropriate working controls for stored and material parts, not temperature controlled, humidity controlled, pardon me, rotation. So we look for inventory controls here. Do we have adequate storage facilities, or are we looking at things appropriately? Is things labeled correctly? Is your waste management collection barrels properly labeled so we know what goes on there? Is machine guarding, if necessary, is in place? So we look for several different things like that. This opens the door for a lot of activities here. Then 7.6. 7.6 is calibration. Or at least that's what we refer to as a calibration section. And I warn you that every auditor thinks they're an expert at calibration, including me. But the truth is, it's an easy thing for auditors to audit, is calibration. It's also an easy area for your customers to come in and audit. It's audited a lot, but as much as it's audited, we still find problems in this area. And calibration is the foundation. It's a fundamental. It's the baseline for the integrity of the dimensions of your product. It's got to be correct. We must maintain traceability, and we look at it because it is so foundational to the product that you build. We see a lot of out-of-count equipment. We see a lot of delinquent equipment that they just considered it lost. There's no robust system in place to take care of delinquent equipment. When we ask, what do you do about it? Well, we put it on a list. I don't know that a list will ever fix anything. The recall systems are oftentimes manual, or it doesn't matter as long as they're effective. And then this last one I show here, validity assessment. This is a kind of a common thing we write, and companies don't understand it oftentimes. But the requirement is you must have records of the validity assessment that you performed when a piece of equipment was found to be out of tolerance during calibration. The calibrator must notify the user that, hey, this thing was 20% out of cal. The user then must assess the validity of products that this instrument may have been used to measure, whether those products are in-house or out-of-house. You gotta determine the risk associated with using this piece of equipment, and you got to record that assessment, capture it, because if someone else later on says, "What did you do?" If you didn't capture that validity assessment, you can't prove you did it, and we find that an issue too often. Under the internal audits, we look for effectiveness more than anything else on internal audits. Most companies do internal audits and do a rather good job. It's been beat up over the years pretty strongly. A lot of companies they're hiring external auditors to do their internal audits. A lot of companies are sharing it with other facilities, with other companies nearby. They may have their own internal people been trained to it. It may be cross-functional people trained. It may be the people under auditing group, the quality group. It doesn't matter as long as internal audits are being done and they're effective. And how do we evaluate effectiveness? Do the audits result in improvements? Do the audit result in findings that are corrected? If I go to a company, they've done internal audits for the last 2 years, they've had no findings and no opportunities for improvement. Guaranteed that's going to be an effectiveness issue. Not conducting audits, the frequency not defined in the company's procedures, not auditing all processes. If you've identified your quality process, your quality management system process, we expect you to audit based on process auditing, not element auditing. The standard doesn't say that, but we expect you to do process auditing. If you don't do process auditing, we'll probably talk to you about an observation of some kind. But we do expect processes to be audited, all processes to be audited. Oftentimes we see auditors does not have adequate training. Now, adequate training does not mean they have to receive training from an outside provider. It just means they got to have adequate training. It's just like you wouldn't put somebody on an NC machine if they hadn't had any training. You wouldn't say, go out there and give it a try. Here's a piece of beryllium copper, a couple $100,000. Give it a try, and we'll see how well you can do it. No, we would train them before we ask them to do that. Any skill set, including auditing, would require some level of training. Impartiality of auditors occasionally comes up in smaller companies that do their own audits. We don't make a big deal out of it, but we do expect to see that all processes are audited and independent audits being taken place. Again, not finding anything is a dead giveaway of maybe not, particularly if I come in a company and write 25 findings and they've had nothing written in the last 2 years. I would expect internal auditors to find 10 times what I find. Inadequate corrective action. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of ways, because corrective action is one of those things that it gets all of us in trouble. But we do expect to see the corrective action on internal audits because it's a requirement. We'll get back to this in just a minute. It's also a requirement that you have follow-up, that you show follow-up internal audits. And sometimes we don't see that. Now, a lot of companies will use their CAR form, the same CAR form for corrective actions from product defects. They'll use the same CAR form for process defects that's found under internal audits. It can be used, and most companies do use the same one. There's a few little nuanced differences in some of the wording, but it's acceptable. We will take care of it. Okay, common issues included in the evidence of conformity. This is the inspection piece of it. We see misinspection steps, unauthorized changing to the planning, questionable sampling plans is a big issue for us. Companies will put a sampling plan together, or they'll show the sampling plan that they created themselves. That's dangerous because you've got to be some statistical validity to that sample plan, or it's got to be directed by a customer. There are industry standards out there that when a question comes up, what kind of plan can I use? Industry standards are certainly acceptable. Controlled non-conforming product under 8.3. We're looking, who is responsible for making disposition? Sometimes it's not defined, and it should be defined. And what made them king for a day? How did they get that qualification of making those decisions? That's got to be in the standard. It's one of those requirements. And commonly we see scrap not appropriately controlled. Now, and the key word is controlled in our particular case, because the standard says, you know, that the scrap shall be conspicuously and permanently marked or positively controlled until physically rendered unusable. That does not mean everything has to be torn up, it has to be marked. It's just, I'm looking for the control. Can you get to this part to use it? Is it adequately controlled until it is rendered unusable? We're looking for that control level. Corrective action. I'll spend a little time here on corrective action. This is the number one reason that most audits get rejected. This is the number one reason that most your NCRs that we write, that the audits don't get turned in because of lack of corrective action. It's also one of the things that we look at when we look at your system, that it really is not as robust as it can be. Some people misunderstand the word corrective and correction. Those are different things. The number one reason, though, corrective actions are kicked back is because we have a lack of root cause analysis, RCA. We expect to see strong root cause. Some people use the 5Y technique. There's other techniques you can use also, FMEAs and House of Quality, all kind of things. But it kind of starts from there. But we see a lack of the corrective action itself. The corrective action has got to address the root cause. Corrective action has to address the root cause, not the reported problem, but the cause of the reported problem. We see a lack of a timely implementation, or sometimes delinquent corrective actions. Go to a company that got 53 cars and half of them are been open for a year. That doesn't tell me that they're very serious about this. Lack of documented activities, lack of supplier cars. Sometimes we see no supplier cars, and yet their main problem that they have is supplier issues. And then we look to see how you handle customer complaints. Do you put them into your system, or do you handle them on a customer's document? If you handle them on a customer's document, how do you count for them in your system and your corrective action activities? We look to see how you lump all this stuff together, how you consider it. Customer complaints is certainly a big one. Let me give an example here for corrective action. The number one reason audit packages get rejected is for poor corrective action. Number one reason companies get suspended is for the lack of corrective action. A couple of comments here. Lack of restoring conformity within 60 days is a cause for a recommendation for suspension. The same or similar finding on consecutive audits is cause for suspension. I mentioned earlier something like calibration. If I find something out of cal this time and you fix it, next time I come back if it's out of cal, this is what I got to do. I got to write a major against your corrective action system. I got to write a major against your corrective calibration, and then I got to recommend suspension. So recurring problems is a big issue for us. So these are requirements under AS. These are requirements on AS9100. This is something that the aerospace industry has and not the ISO industry. This is what we expect to see, kind of a way of looking at it. It's 4 phases, really. The phase 1 begins with a good reported finding. I promise you, make sure your auditors write the finding up and not the cause or what they think is the finding. Be specific. It's a good root cause starts with a good documented finding. Oftentimes, we as auditors is part of the problem there. And then we got to fix the reported problem. Correction. Correction is action taken to fix the reported problem. If I found a blue Dr. Pepper can, the fix is I painted it red. I also have to do containment. How many other blue Dr. Pepper cans do I have out there? I got to gather them all up and repaint those suckers also. So that deals with the reported problem. Reported problem is I got blue Dr. Pepper cans. I gathered up, see how many I had, and I repainted them. Now, that's remedial action. That's action to stop the bleeding, check for other cuts, and doctor the wound, as I like to put it. That focus on fixing the reported problem. Phase 3 then deals with focusing on fixing the determined cause. So it starts off by taking action to, well, it actually starts with root cause. Action taken to determine the cause of the problem. So what caused those Dr. Pepper cans to get painted blue? Then once I determine the cause, then I got to take action to fix the determined cause. That's corrective action. Correction deals with fixing the reported problem. Corrective action focuses on fixing the cause of the problem. It's permanent action. Eliminate the source or the cause of the wounds. We misconstrue correction and corrective action way too much. Our new standard will have a place for both correction and containment. Right now we expect to see correction and containment in the correction block on our forms. So both things must be in one block. In the future, when 9101E comes out, which starting in January, we will have 2 blocks on the form. And then the last phase focuses on the follow-up action. You must verify that the correction and the corrective action has in fact been implemented. And you've got to validate that the corrective action is effective. It won't happen again. And then you close the nonconformity. Measure analysis includes, this is preventive action. Preventive action. Most of us say it wrong, including myself. Most companies do a rather poor job of documenting their preventive action, but they do a good job of doing preventive action. And we try to look for a meter there. We look at what your procedure says, are you following your procedure? But if I don't see any preventive actions, any documented preventive actions, and your system says you have one, then I question your effectiveness. Timeliness is also an issue, and then certainly follow-up. Okay, final thoughts. I'm sorry I'm taking so long. The key to a successful audit, good process identifications. Have you defined your QMS processes? All the QMS processes that deal with all the elements of the standard. Do you have good measures associated with each of your process? Measures that really measure the effectiveness, the success of the process. Are you doing good management reviews? Are you doing good value-added internal audits? Do you understand, and are you doing effective action? Is it a baseline for your internal, for your improvements? And then are you really focused on a customer? Because everything we look at, we're going to ask, what does the customer think about it? What does the customer evaluate it? We ask now a lot of questions about what are your customer scorecards, because we're looking for performance effectiveness, not only conformance effectiveness. Okay, I'd like to open it up for questions. You can type them in. Got a few minutes to answer them. If I can figure out how to do it. I'm sure you're having the same question. Let me see if I can do this here. Okay. One question says, I can't hear anything. Oh, well, I'm sorry, Stephanie. I hope you're the only one that couldn't hear me. It looks like everybody's pretty well satisfied. If you have any questions, I left you my the frequently asked question here on the 7514B. That was a question that came up again for the exclusion. Yeah, the exclusion, you can take exclusion to 7514. That's at post-delivery support, less B, because we expect you to do B. How would you define an effective external AS9100 auditor? One that adds value. One that actually does, when they finish the audit, you answer the question by saying, I got something out of that audit. The auditor helped me understand something better than what I understood. Not only, it's not the point of an audit to find fault. And too many of us think that's the case. The purpose of an audit is to add value. And as an aerospace certified person, the aerospace industry expects me to act on their behalf. And when I'm doing it, when I say that you're qualified to be an aerospace supplier, I'm putting not only my credentials on the line, but I'm also putting all those other certified suppliers on the line that says you're as good as they are. Okay, I think I've answered generally the questions. I think a couple of you here has made comments. I have one question. I'll just go ahead and finish up on this one, or a couple of here more. This one deals with, if I can read the whole thing, I'm sorry, I had to, it says, auditors shall, this was asked by Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay. It says auditors shall not audit their own work. In our company, we have 20 people. Can two people in the same work area audit each other's work? Can their supervisor audit either? If the task belongs to those people or that supervisor, they should not be auditing that work. If you ask me if the accountant can audit the accounting department, the answer is probably no. If you're asking me if the auditor, pardon me, if the inspector, receiving inspector can audit the receiving inspection function, no. Can the receiving inspection function audit the shipping inspection function? Yes, if that's not his responsibility. Now, if the supervisor's over both those areas, the supervisor should not audit either of those areas. Can we expect the next version of okay. This was asked for Sandy. She said, when can we expect the next revision to AS9100? Good question, Sandy. It's being written now. As you know, the ISO 9001 is in its final release day issue. It'll be released next year. And ISO 9001 went from an 8-element document to an 8 to 10 document. It added lots of stuff. It was a significant change. The AS standard will comply because that's the ISO document still a foundation document. And the standard is being considered now. The team is together. They're writing it. It probably will be ready at the end of next year, soon after the ISO is released. It says, will this presentation be available to us to share with our management teams? Yes, you can go to the PGR website. It'll be on there. And just ignore the misspelled words, please. And the Texas slang. You don't have to take that on there. Hello, this is Mike. Is the webinar be available on? Yes, it will be on the website. Roland asks, as an external auditor, how do you handle transfer situations where former registrars found 0 NCRs and you find a boatload. First of all, I never ever recommend transfer audits, and neither does the aerospace industry. We're trying to discourage companies to transfer registrars. We're really trying to now Perry Johnson may not appreciate that. They may want all the transfers they can get, and I'm sure they do. But as the aerospace industry, we're trying to get companies to rethink that. Why are you really transferring? Is the first question we're going to ask. Are you not getting value from the auditing that you're having done? And that sounds to me like if you've had 0 findings from this registrar for quite some time, you're probably not getting much value. But you ought to go back and deal with the registrar with that question. You may have not, the auditor may have been there too long. So try to use the registrar you got first and work out the issues that you have with that. Now, if you're training for money, I understand that. It's an economic situation. But what findings do you see related to configuration management? Sandy asks. Configuration management is, we're usually asking how do you do configuration audits, because that was a new requirement in the standard. Configuration audits, if you answer it by saying we do it first article, we do in-process auditing, continuing things, it's good. Configuration management is a little bit misnomered in the standard. It's configuration control would have been a better word for it, because configuration management in itself begins with design and is filtered down with implementation, build to print. Non-value added audits, just a comment. When will we be required to implement the next revision as soon as they're released? Well, first of all, AS9100E is released right now. That's how auditors are going to be auditing. We at Perry Johnson will start auditing that come January. The new release standards will have a timetable established by the IAQG. It's usually 18 months to a year or a cycle, but that's yet to be determined, Sherlyn. Guys, I'm out of time. I appreciate the questions. There's a few more I didn't get to. I apologize for it. You can certainly send the information to Perry Johnson. They will follow up with any issues you have. I appreciate your time, and this is Larry Beck signing out. Thank you.